Welcome to this new virtual series, A Walk in the Park with Gil. My name is Gil Peñalosa, in Spanish, Guillermo Peñalosa. I was born in Bogota, Colombia, and lived during my childhood across from a public park. My parents say that actually I lived in the park. Many years later, I served as Bogota's head of parks, sports and recreation. Magnificent opportunity. I led the design and construction of over 200 parks, from Simón Bolívar Park with over 100 hectares to multiple neighborhood ones, mostly in low-income areas. Now I live in Canada, and 15 years ago created 880 Cities, a non-profit organization which focuses on parks, streets, and other public spaces and their uses by people of all ages and backgrounds. I was elected chair of World Urban Parks twice and now serve as its ambassador. Welcome, Rob.
Gil, it's very good to be with you this morning. And yes, it is 1 o'clock in the morning, but it was always a pleasure to talk to an audience about how you change a city and particularly how you make a city green. So I look forward to it.
Thank you.
All right. That's always the most nervous part of these presentations, I must tell you.
And by the way, don't worry about the time. People are here to see you, not me. So I'll follow up with questions, but feel free. And thanks a lot.
All right. I'd just like to start by acknowledging that I'm talking to you from the lands of the Bunurong, Boonwurrung, and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations. And I'd like to pay my respects to them, their elders, past and present. The story I'm going to tell you today really started with back in the early 1980s. I came to Melbourne in 1983 and I was employed to write a strategy plan. The plan you can see on the screen now. And the idea of the councillors of the day, where they were worried about the way the city was going, and their vision as the city had emptied out and become a donut city, was to produce a 24-hour city that looked and felt like Melbourne. And the document was obviously much more comprehensive than that, but that was the clear vision, that the city needed to come back in on itself. It needed to become a city that wasn't with a dead centre. And that's the project we set out on in 1983. The strategy landed in 1985, and one of the documents that sat within it was this document called Grids and Greenery. And what we did in this document was try to understand the nature of the city we were creating for the future. And I think it's interesting that we use those two words. It was a gridded city, it's a planned city, it's laid out in an orthogonal plan, but it was a city that had magnificent parks around it. The grid itself didn't have many parks, and we'll talk about that. The patterns of the city were, as you can see on that, it's waterways. It was built on 3 rivers. The built form of the city was very distinctive. It had a 40-meter height limit and very dense development in the center. The street patterns, as I said, were orthogonal. They'd been laid out. The central city was tilted at not a true north because it laid itself out parallel to the river. It had a magnificent public transport system, but one of the cities that kept the tram system. But what it did have, as you can see here, is this ring of beautiful parks that surrounded the city, which I call the Emerald Necklace. And these really represented the character of the city. And this gives you an example of many of those parks that surrounded the city. So we were well endowed with large parks close to the central city. But for whatever reasons, the central city itself didn't have public spaces. It didn't have a city square, for instance. And many say that was to do with the governors of the day not wanting, this grew up on the wealth of mining to close by cities, didn't want areas where the public could collect and, protest or cause trouble. But that left us with a legacy of how do we bring back those spaces into our central city. One of the first exercises we did, which was on that wider system, was there was a competition for a park that's called Royal Park. And I think that's unfortunate that the name is Royal and not an Indigenous name. And it's one of the missions I've been on for a few years to get this renamed to better reflect the nature of the landscape. But this was a competition won by 2 landscape architects, Ron Jones being one of them. And what they did, and what impressed me at the time, was they didn't put things into the park. The danger, I think, with many landscapes is we fill them up with stuff. What they did is they stripped this back to its essentials. They looked at the landscape. They looked at how the landscape read with the sky, and they produced images like this, which I find very evocative of the Australian landscape. And we didn't have a magnificent park like this in the city. And the challenge of this park was to bring back that landscape, which we've now done for the last 35 years. And what you can see here is the park. And one of the last things, in fact, I skipped over that last slide, but you can see down the bottom here, this green bit. And just recently, that was a site that had a car park on it, and it had an old hospital. And we took that site back as the hospital modernized, and we dealt with the car parking in a different way. And we got back the corner of this park, this magnificent area here. So you can actually enter the park and rise up into it. And the landscape has grown up, and you can see the indigenous trees. And we've created a garden there that talks about the 7 seasons of the Kulin Nations. And these are based on the plants and the animals that come out at particular times of the year. And we've managed to reinterpret that in what is a children's playground. And we have put many playgrounds into the city. And it's one of my passions that I know Gil shares of, the young children being out in the landscape. And you can see some of the aspects. It's still reasonably young as an intervention. You can see the size of the trees. But this was the completion of an exercise that started back in 1985. And I start with that because cities change slowly. And the challenge we have is, how do we make sure there's a momentum that carries along with the city? I'm going to talk to you about what I now think my profession is. I'm an architect and urban designer. But I think what I've done over my career is become an urban choreographer. And that is to bring as many people together to help change the city and work with them and spread the intellect and the message about how we can change our cities incrementally over time to make them better cities. Cities, I think, are made up of 8 essential ingredients. And I'm not going to go through all of those, but you can see them listed here. And I think if you get these 8 ingredients, you get economically vital and socially cohesive and sustainable cities. And I've given a reference down the bottom where there is a document that speaks about this, and I'd recommend that you read that. One of the important things that we had to bring back downtown was mixed use. We had a city that was predominantly a business center, and what we had to do was bring back a residential population. And we did that at the crash of the property market in the late 1980s, where when the property market crashed, there were a lot of vacant properties as people moved from the old office accommodation back up into the new office accommodation that had been built in the early 80s and was now empty, and they lowered their rents and drew people in. This project we called Postcode 3000, which was the postcode of the central city. And back in 1982, we only had 685 dwellings in that central city. And I think this reflected the donut effect that we had, that people had moved out to suburbia and left the downtown. And it had become an area that in many cases over the weekends was literally deserted. And so the opportunity we recognized in the strategy plan was to bring back this population. What we did over the next couple of years through a program of converting old office buildings and providing incentives was increase that 685 to 41,000 dwellings downtown. This fundamentally changed the downtown of central Melbourne. It made it a mixed-use city. It became vibrant. We had bars, cafes, restaurants, people living, a very walkable city. But now what we had was a real crisis on open space, because what we were doing is we essentially had this return to the city of the pedestrian, and we'd started to need to widen the footpaths and make more areas for pedestrians. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I call it greater green. And over the last 30 years of the city, we've converted over 80 hectares of asphalt and other underutilized infrastructure to pedestrian parks and park uses. And I'm going to take you through that journey and share it a little bit with you. As I've said, it's a long journey. It starts back in 1983, and I know you can't read the slide, but I'm sure Gil will make these slides available to you. And it was a number of interventions over that period where we started back in, I can remember, with a small street called Mason Street, and we planted 10 trees and we widened the footpath by 1.5 meters, and we were very excited. And we've accelerated that. And we've got to the stage where now it's become a much more rigorous program, and we're starting to take back more space. What we realized, and I was in charge of the Parks and Gardens for about 10 years, one of the many portfolios that transitioned through my area, which was a way of inculcating the urban design values into the larger organization, was that if we had to get the open space we needed for our population, we would have to spend $700 million on purchasing land. We didn't have $700 million. So at this stage, the decision I made, and with the councillors obviously, that we would start to be more aggressive in the way we took over space from the city and recreated greenery. We did it in many ways. We did it by increasing neighbourhood parks, and I won't go through all of these because I'll talk you through them, but there were a number of interventions that we made, particularly in the streets, and as I say, taking over those. The local character of Melbourne is one of the important things, and that local character could be seen in many ways. It could be seen as something as simple as the paving material that we used. And back in 1985, we said, we're not going to have multitudes of paving. We're going to have only one material. It's either asphalt or it's going to be bluestone or basalt, which is our local stone. And what we will also do is we will build on the mixed use that we're building back into the city through Postcode 3000, and also we'll start creating a high-quality public realm. So those are three of those essential ingredients that I talked to right at the start. The interesting thing, and Gil mentioned at the moment, is that streets make up the majority of our open spaces. While they make up, as he said, 30 to 40% of the city's area, they make up 80% of the public realm. That's the space outside of buildings. And so if you think about that, if you design a good street, you design a good city. And I think that's a message I'd like you to take away from this, if it's the only message, is that we need to design cities with the best streets that they can be. And that shouldn't be that hard, although we seem to find it quite difficult, and we get our streets dominated by things like cars. The character of local Melbourne was built up. We had very big blocks, 200 meters by 100 meters. They were subdivided in the 19th century. And to make money, they divided the properties into smaller parcels, and then they had lanes and arcades that connected them. And in the 20th century, they started to amalgamate those into larger blocks. And this was something that worried us, because what you were getting was the streets, as you can see at the top, were turning into internalized shopping centers. This building, which is the one you can see down here in this bottom slide here, is designed by a world-famous architect, I.M. Pei. But it was a model that wasn't Melbourne. It internalized, and if you do this to your streets, you'll kill them slowly. So we started a message as you have to externalize, and you can see down below, even on this one, we got them to modify it later on in its life and externalize it. We started to allow the city to become dominated by the pedestrians. So a lot of the lanes and arcades that used to take cars, I think has changed, other than some signage. The center of the road is now dominated by tables and chairs, by just closing that road off and allowing people to use the streets. So this is not an expensive exercise. This is an exercise that any city can do. We put in guidelines about standard materials like our footpaths, and we started to make every development as it went through use those standards. So you go back to 1985, the extent of the bluestone in the downtown was very small. You can see here a few areas. But if you make every building and every development and use your policies as well to put back the stone, by 2014, we'd almost completely changed the city. And many young people now think that our city was always paved in bluestone, which wasn't the case. It gives us a great walking surface. It gives us a surface that we can put bars, cafes, and restaurants on. And as we paved it, we expanded those footpaths and we planted trees. So tree planting became a major exercise in the city. You know, the first thing I notice when I go to a city is, have they got street trees? Have they planted trees? Because this is the easiest thing to do. And you can see here we intervened in streets, and you can see some of the before and afters. And these are some of the trees that we just planted in the downtown grid since 1993. And with that, we used the streets to use public art, and public art sometimes hid the necessity services that you had. So the slide at the top here that I'm pointing to is actually a ventilation shaft for a Telstra cable, but we made them use an artist to turn it into something attractive. And we introduced art to also make people come back to the lanes. We had a laneways policy, and I also had arts and culture in my portfolio for a short while, about 10 years as well. And that enabled me to use public art as a way of bringing people back into the downtown. What we also did is we started taking asphalt away. So you can see here, cars parked on both sides of the road. We took cars off one side of the road and we expanded the footpaths. We gave people the dignity of walking on wide footpaths. We closed in 1992 the main street through the city to cars and started to turn it over to public transport, bicycles and pedestrians. 1992 was a really big year for Melbourne. It was the year that we closed Swanston Street, Postcode 3000, started to hit its straps, and we got a lot of residential, and we regained our frontage onto our river, the Yarra. And you can see Swanston Street was an ordinary street. It was not very good, and in fact, it was dying. And what we did here is we widened the footpath by 3.5 meters, planted 100 trees. And suddenly, despite all the concerns that the retailers had that this would change the city and kill the city, we saw the pedestrian numbers increase, and they increased dramatically, to the extent that we could now make getting onto public transport a more dignified experience. You didn't stand in the middle of the road. You had proper shelters, and you can see the trees as well that we put in. All the furniture is designed by us. It's not JC&Co. It's Melbourne. It's our own language, our own furniture, and that's very much about our identity. And you can see the impact that these trees have had on Swanston Street, a street that didn't used to have trees down the middle. And there used to be a protection of a vista here, but now that vista is almost closed as the trees come across the road. And the people have come back. And they've come back in huge numbers. And this has set us a very pleasant challenge of how do we find more space for them. We've also used a secret weapon in Melbourne, something that I wouldn't mind having now, but I'm going to go back to bed, so I won't have a coffee. And that is that we use coffee, and Melbourne's famous for its coffee. We've got a big Italian community and a European community. And we used this and said, if we're going to widen footpaths, then let's use them. Let's use them for bars, cafes, restaurants, selling newspapers, selling fruit, flowers, and externalize the activity of our city onto these areas. We designed furniture that was sometimes whimsical to make it an interesting experience for people to use. But the essential part is we started stripping the streets back and using that space. So here you can see one of our first streets in Lygon Street, which is Italian area, where we widened the footpaths and put medians in to bring back that space. We dug up medians and planted trees. Here we took a small roundabout. You can see the small roundabout here, and you can see the width of the road. Now this is in an inner city area, North Melbourne. And we had very wide streets. And people said, well, we need the wide streets. We said, well, we can still give you the streets. You can still have the circulation system. It's a one-way system. But we turned a 500-meter park into a 5,000 square meter park. And that saved us $14 million in land purchases and gave us a local park. And you can see where the park used to be. This was for heritage reasons. We had to show where the original edge of the street was, and this is the median. So those are those trees there that you can see sitting in the middle. And this was a very simple exercise. And you can see the park now from above, and it's made in this neighborhood a local park that they didn't have. This is an area that was short of parks in the gardens. Near high-density housing in Carlton, we've closed the streets, as you can see here, and turned it over to active recreation. This is where we've got basketball courts, futsal, all of those sports that you need. And at the moment, we've taken a street to one of the major boulevards of Melbourne, which we closed during the Commonwealth Games in 2006. We closed the end and created a public park down here. And in doing that, we dropped the numbers of cars here from 30,000 a day to 15,000 a day. And with that, we came back a few years later and said, we can turn this into a linear park, again, in a high-density area that needs open space. So all of these colors that you're seeing here are currently being converted into open space, and that'll be completed by the middle of next year. Roads like this that are very wide are going to be converted into open space of different natures. There's some that are more active like this, and there's some that are very green. This is the first section outside 2 theatres that have been closed. And this is a hard wearing surface where the cafes will spill out into. In the middle of the tram lines, we started planting so we can get water back into the ground, which was one of the major impediments in Australia, that we've got a very dry country and we need to really save all the water we can get. But we've done other things. We've gone back to little spaces that used to just have a chair in and more pigeons than people. And what we did is we designed little cafes and put them on the edge of these squares. So this little area here in Melbourne sums up much of our policy. We took back a space, we designed and did a private partnership. So the private paid for this little cafe and gave people a vantage point where they could sit and overlook a square that had a chessboard. We cut a hole in the town hall that used to be a window and opened it up. We put a flower stall on the corner and made them trade by giving them a very cheap lease until 10 o'clock in the evening. And we paved the streets. And we've gone through the city and we've taken traffic islands and converted them into small public spaces. So this traffic island became a celebration of our Chinese community, one of the early communities that came to Melbourne with the gold mines, and given people not a traffic island, but a place to sit and a place to celebrate the culture. We took a city square that was failing. It had won many architectural prizes. But what it failed to have was activity around the edge. The key to public space is you need to have activity around the edge. So we, in fact, sold off to the bottom of this water wall and created a smaller park, but a park that actually had activity on the edge. And this park has become very, very popular. Simple places where people can sit and cafes have brought the people back and they've regained ownership of this. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's having an underground station built under it, but will come back in about 3 years' time. We turned railway yards. You can see the railway yards running here and these huge buildings that were built in front of our cathedral and obscured the buildings. And we, with the state government, looked at that, and these buildings were removed. And we opened it up and created Federation Square, and with it, a park, Burrung Ma. So one of the visions we had back in 1986 with the Grids and Greenery document I showed you at the start, you can see those buildings I've just shown you, the gas and fuel, and you can see the extent of the railway lines, which cut the city off from its river. And what we wanted was to go from that to this. We wanted to get continuity through these broken spaces and create this park that goes around the edge of the city and surrounds the eastern edge of the city. If you take this park from where it starts in the north and runs down to the ocean, it's bigger than Central Park in New York. It's a huge area. And this is what we created. We cut the railway lines down to 12 lines. We moved the marshalling yards out to the periphery, and we designed a park for events because our green parks were suffering from having events in them. So we designed a park here that was more hard-wearing, reflected the nature of the topography that had been there pre-settlement, and created Burrung Ma. We also started to face a crisis. At the turn of the century, we had what people call the Millennium Drought. It was the start of climate change, and we were starting to see our city heat up to the extent that we were seeing more people die through heat stress than died in the bushfires, the horrific bushfires of 2009. And this was when I had parks and gardens under my portfolio. And I must say, it was an emotional experience for me to see trees dying. And what we surveyed was that if we did not do anything, we were going to lose 48% of our trees in 20 years. So we needed to start. And we put in place an urban forest strategy. It was one of the first in the world. In fact, Bloomberg celebrated it at a conference in London, which surprised me. I walked into the foyer, and the only project being celebrated was Melbourne's urban forest strategy. But what we had done is said, we're going to save this, and we're going to do more than that. We're not just going to save these trees. we're going to change the nature of our landscape. So you can see Melbourne had many gardens and they'd grown up after a long period. This is a millennium drought. You can see what droughts looked like before, but this was the millennium drought. So it was the start of climate change. And at that stage, we put the urban forest strategy in and we started to talk about planting trees and lowering the temperature of our city. When we wrote the strategy, I said to my people, I don't want you to talk about trees, because if we start talking about whether it's an exotic species or an indigenous species, we'll go around in circles. I want you to talk about the metrics of what we need to do. We need to go from 22% to 40% canopy cover. We need to get increased diversity because we're going to lose our trees if we have a monoculture. We need to improve the vegetation health. We need to improve the moisture and water quality in the soil. We need to improve the urban ecology, and we need to engage the community. And that was a very easy strategy to sell, because you ask people if they want trees, and yes, they want trees. So we got the strategy in place very quickly and with total support from the population and the politicians. We also then put in place an app where if you walk around Melbourne today, you can, on your phone, find Melbourne's urban forest strategy, and you can go around and you can identify any tree that you're walking past. And it will tell you its life expectancy and what type of tree it is. We gave it an email number, and we hadn't expected, but what happened is, what happened was that people started emailing our trees, and this went viral. We had millions of people writing to our trees. We got oaks in North America writing to our oaks, and we responded. And that could have been a career-limiting move, to be writing back to people about trees. But it's this that made it go viral, and it was this that was picked up by Bloomberg and celebrated. We started to reposition our landscapes. We started to think about the nature of the plants we were planting and whether they could actually withstand the temperatures that we were talking about. So we looked at, woody meadows and worked with experts and the universities to produce a landscape that would be more resilient in the climate we were now facing. We were losing water. You can see here the amount of rainfall we were losing. Sometimes we were getting it in big spurts, but not consistently to the higher quantities that we had previously. So a problem with a dry continent was becoming even drier. And so what we started to do was collect water. We collected by overland flow in wetlands like this. This is in Royal Park, the one I showed you right at the start. And we used that water back in the gardens. We also started putting medians into our streets. We'd started this back in the 1980s, but we increased the program. So we created permeable surfaces. So all those blue lines are wide medians. The asterisks are big tanks. We put in big tanks uphill of the flow for two reasons. You can see they're located next to gardens. So we could collect water and we could actually put the water back into the gardens. But also, we could slow down the overland flow, because what we used to get was flooding down here at the bottom of the city as all the water flowed out of these areas and flowed down and collected where there used to be a stream down Elizabeth Street. So this was one of the strategies we had. And we did this in many ways. We collected water straight off the street into a tree pit. So our trees are below the footpath by about 500 millimeters. And the water runs off the street, fills the tree pit before it goes into the pipe. So we try to keep the water out of the pipe for as long as possible. We planted these medians, and this was one of the early ones we put in back in the 1980s. And this is my family. That's my daughter, and these are my grandchildren. And little did I think back in the 1980s that with COVID, these areas would become so important to the local areas in the inner city as people came out. But they're also important because they allow the water to get back into the soil and allow us to plant trees. We started using green asphalt. We started getting a permeable asphalt so that water running off the street actually penetrates the trees. So these trees that have been planted, and I haven't been back to photograph these, but these would be much older and bigger now. The footpath around them allows the water to go into the soil, be collected, and feed these trees. And then there were tanks. And when I suggested we could build a huge tank in one of our most historic gardens, people were slightly skeptical. But at that stage, I was in charge of parks and gardens. And what I decided we could do in building this tank, which was 5 million litres, is we could take a depot that we had, and this is our depot here, and it was a bit of a hodgepodge. It had been built up over many decades, and people had just plonked stuff down, and it wasn't an efficient depot. So we redesigned the depot. We made it more efficient. We took less space. So you can see this line of trees here is this line of trees here. So the depot shrunk. We took back public space and made it green space. We took back 4,000 square meters. The tank is underneath here, and the rain garden that purifies it is here. And we've got a cafe and restaurant that works with our historic conservatory and Cook's Cottage, and is a bit of a tourist attraction. So we rationalized through this the use of an existing piece of infrastructure and got more open space, collected more water, and got the other levels of government to contribute towards this project. And this is it today. The building in there has actually got a green wall and disappears, and through that open window they sell coffees now, as we're allowed to exercise during COVID. We put tanks under roads. This is in East Melbourne, where this is under a road. And then we put the rain garden in the median over, so that we could purify the water and use it back in the park to the left-hand side. And at the moment, we've got about 10 parks being built. Some of them are already completed. In fact, this one here that you can see this development going up. And before it was demolished, they had a problem. The facade was falling off into the street, so they closed part of the street. And I said, well, there's no reason to reopen that street afterwards. The world has not changed. And so this is in the central city. This is our main street, Collins Street. And we've taken that back now and created a park that works with the hotel that's come in this new development. We've also done this in some of our other inner city areas. You can see here where there used to be a large road to either side of this park. And recently we completed taking that back and just putting a single road on either side and reducing the amount of parking and widening that park. And we've just opened a playground in this location here. We're doing this up in the university, where we're closing 2 roads and increasing the size of the park. We've already done it on this side. This is our metro going in, and these are being used as the side sheds. But that will come back, and that whole thing will become a much larger park in amongst our student population. So you can see the sort of thing that's happening here. These are the same 2 parks. This is what we had before. We had these very wide streets, and we had parking in the middle. And you can see here we've taken this back and given it to the parks. You can see 2 different parks that are close to them. This is the one where we've taken it back, and you can see the narrow road. This is the one next to it, which we will take back shortly. And these are the areas we're taking back and turning back into expanded parkland. A huge project we're doing is that there was a car park up at our Queen Victoria Market, had 700 cars on it. We bought a site here, and we've done a redevelopment on it, and we will take the cars off here and put them underneath in a flat-floored development, so they can be adapted over time as we have fewer cars. But we're about to create the biggest public square that Melbourne will have. And it'll be called Market Square, and it sits next to our Victorian Market, and it will be something that enlivens that part of the city. And the analysis of that, people said, this is a very expensive thing. But I won't run you through all of this. But what we did is we bought the park, the site that I showed you, for 86 million. We built community facilities, including the car park. So we've got a city library going in there and community facilities. We sold off part of the site to a developer. We were able to close a couple of community facilities, of course, so we're getting more efficient ones. We put in affordable housing, which we got the state government to pay us the value of the land. And so we got 40 affordable units, and we had a residual land value. But then we had the value of the car park that we created. So the economics of this for cities are that the public can get more out of the economy of developing sites than many developers do, because this is something we would have had to pay for. And now we're getting it through this mixed-use development. With COVID, we've taken the opportunity to accelerate the program. We've looked at how we respond, how we recover, and how we regenerate. And we've had a number of programs, which I won't run through tonight because it's quite a complex project. But the idea was to put in 40 kilometres of new bike lanes, to close more streets, to increase the urban forest of the city. These are interventions, including the return of public art to many of our lanes. But now we're looking at closing major streets within the central grid to accommodate more life. And this is the sort of thing we do. We're taking parking lanes and in sometimes trafficable lanes. And here's one that went in as a temporary park during COVID. And this will never come out. It'll be made permanent because the people now say, no, we'd rather be sitting in the street than driving cars past it. And so we're slowly removing the cars from the city. I'm going to end on a much bigger subject because I've spoken to you about the central city. But one of the challenges for Melbourne, and I think a lot of the American cities and all the Southern Hemisphere cities in many ways, is the way our cities are expanding. We seem to have two types of development. We have the downtown development, and then we go to the fringe, and we have this urban sprawl that goes out. And this is like a cancer on our cities. This slowly, through travel times and people sitting for long periods, obesity, etc., becomes a real issue. So we looked at Melbourne 10 years ago and said, does it have to be this way? We've got a public transport system, our trams, and we've got trains, which I haven't shown on this, and we've got a gridded road system with buses. What if we built back in on the city rather than going out? And you can see from studies done what's happening to all the capital cities of Australia. This is called a vampire study done by Griffith University. It's vulnerability to petrol and mortgage prices. You can see in 2001 that people had reasonable amenity. Slowly that's closing out. These people are starting to struggle. They've got economic difficulties. They're having to own 2 cars to get to work. And this is becoming a burden on them. So we took a simple premise and said, what if we start putting all our future development around our public transport infrastructure, along our tram lines and our bus lines, in our greyfield sites, so that we start to create the high streets that we so desire. And in the spaces in between, we don't build them. What we do here is we start to plant trees, we start to collect water, we start the urban forest, we put solar panels on roofs. Australia has had the biggest introduction of solar panels on domestic roofs of any city in any country in the world. So this was a major exercise. And what we could create is the new green wedges of our city. We could make this city one of the greenest cities in the world by just doing this simple thing. And it's a much bigger story, and I'd like to come back at some stage and talk in more detail about this. But what we would basically saying is, let's take streets like this and let's put in development of a reasonable scale, between 5 and 8 stories, not towers, but 5 to 8 stories that line the streets, that make streets that we're familiar with, streets like Paris and other major cities. And that's happened over the last 10 years. It hasn't been public policy, but the developers understood the message and they've started to build back into these streets. And the metrics of that are quite interesting. You can double Melbourne's population from 5 million today to 10 million in 2050, which is what they say the population is going to grow to. You can do it by only intensifying 7.5% of that metro area. And you build it around that public transport infrastructure. You build no higher than 5 to 8 stories. But the thing that really interested me is when I looked at the costs of doing that, we would save $110 billion for every million people that we put back within the existing city, because we wouldn't have to build the new infrastructure. We could save $550 billion in infrastructure costs and make a more sustainable and livable city. That's something I think we all should try and do. Thank you. I've really enjoyed talking to you tonight, and I hope we meet soon. Our challenge now is to ensure that our post-COVID city builds back sustainably. Thank you.
Rob, this has been fascinating. It's almost 2:00 in the morning for you in Melbourne. We all really appreciate it. And I take you up on your offer to come back at the beginning of 2022 to tell us about the 7.5% city. I truly appreciate it. Thank you very much.